Okay, that's right. This thing's on wheels and it's covered and mostly painted. I couldn't help myself. Because of some logistical problems, I'm gonna have to slow down the painting process, and my work couldn't continue until this thing came out of the rack. So I want to start working on the engine, and I couldn't work on it if it was in those rotisseries. So I said, well, I guess the rest of the painting, which is just sort of finish work, is gonna have to take place with it on the wheels. So I spent the afternoon throwing this thing on wheels. Wasn't too difficult of a process. Still have to go through and retorque some of the bolts and replace some of the nylon nuts or nylock nuts. But I think this is the final gear install. All things considered, I don't believe I'm gonna have to pull them off before I fly it again. So this video, I'm gonna talk about paint and sort of some of my processes and what I did to get up to this point. And I guess we'll touch on where I'm going next after this, which I believe will be engines, which is on the shelf, ready to put it on. That's why I put it on these wheels, is because I wanted to get the engine on, and I don't wanna wait for paint any longer before I keep moving on the project. So anyway, the excitement level when I pulled this out of the racks and put this on the wheels went up, 100-fold. So I am so stoked to get this thing finished and flying. And it reminded me of how cool a freaking plane it is when I put it back on the wheels with the thing painted and covered. So anyway, enjoy the video. So I'm in a bit of a dilemma here. I'm waiting on parts from both Kitfox and some paint that's got held up because of the winter storm in Texas. I haven't painted the finish paint on the fuselage. I want to put some basically designs on there that's going to make it look really sweet. And that's basically holding me up from doing any other work. And I'm at a bottleneck where if I don't put these finish coats on, then I don't really want to pull this out of the stand to continue working on it. I thought about it. I can mask off and paint my sort of decorative paint on while this is on the gear. So instead of being held up who knows how long, I'm basically gonna have my life dictated by what UPS and Kitfox want to do with my parts. So I'm just gonna sort of take control and get this thing on the gear and maybe start working on the engine. And if I have to do finish coats on top of this, no problem. I can just mask it pretty easily. I don't really plan on painting the bottom of the plane. I know that might trigger some people, but it's the bottom of the plane unless somebody's right underneath it, which people are. You won't see it, but aesthetics were an afterthought a long time ago. So I was done painting, and that way, because of that, I couldn't work on my engine or anything like that. But I was like, I talked to my uncle and I said, really, there's no reason for me to keep it in the rack other than maybe it might help me a little bit with painting, but at the end of the day, I can just mask off, my gear legs and things like that, and paint won't bother it at all. So that's where I am on the paint status, but let's talk about some of the things that I did on these wings and the fuselage, and talk about maybe some of the mistakes that I made, some of the things I learned, and what I would do differently next time if I had to do this again. Okay, first thing first, I want to talk about something that I think it's Nate Ashton. I may be saying his name wrong, but another guy who built one of these and is currently flying it right now. He has a YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. He said, he commented on one of my videos and he said, you can either make this thing perfect or you can get the project done. And that really resonated with me because I feel like it's always a balance of sort of a decision that I have to make, whether or not I want to make this thing perfect or I want to get the project done. Because I can chase out a lot of these bumps and divots and wrinkles and stuff like that, but it might take me forever. And at the end of the day, there is something that I call the time value of airplane. It's an accounting term, usually used for money. But in my case, I'm saying that an airplane now is worth more than an airplane 2 years from now. So even if it has some flaws and blemishes, I'd rather have the airplane now than wait a long time and not have an airplane now. So that was really helpful for me. It really helped me sort of swallow some of the ideas that this is my first plane and it's not gonna be perfect. So I'm gonna go over some of the things that aren't perfect that I wish I had a little bit of better knowledge of beforehand, and that I would have done differently, that I'm not super proud of, but I don't think most people are gonna see them, and it doesn't really affect the overall functionality of the plane. So aesthetics are a thing of the past at this point. We're going for function over form. All right, so first thing, this right wing here, I was really worried about because something I called cupping in a previous video was obvious in the Laker leading edge before I started covering it. Then when I covered it, it looks pretty wonky. So you have these sort of divots along the wing, one there, one there, one there, that basically ruins that continuously smooth edge. Now, how could I have dealt with this beforehand? It would have been kind of hard to do. It's possible that some of this was done with an iron. My friend was helping me iron, and he left the iron there maybe for too long and sort of warped the fiberglass. Could have been me. I don't even remember. But I think that some of this, like this, was definitely a divot beforehand. And the reason why it's a divot is because there's tension in the fiberglass. So I could have slit that probably at the rib and pulled out that little cupping shape before I went to the covering process. But, you know, it's the top of the wing, and this is a tail dragger. So it might adversely affect flight characteristics just oh so slightly, but it really doesn't deform the airfoil any more than, you know, the fabric would if it didn't have a Laker leading edge. So not really too worried about it, but that is something, you know, that I foresaw being a problem that definitely turned out as a problem after covering. A few other things, you know, when I was painting, there are all these little specks and divots. In the polyfiber manual, they talk about expectations, and you know, you have to understand what are your expectations for your paint job. And they say that this plane's not going to look like a car, and that's one of the things that I didn't really recognize until I thought about it. But cars are flawless nowadays. You have perfectly shiny finishes with no blemishes or whatsoever. I mean, maybe minute, tiny little specks here and there. But at the end of the day, our cars kind of spoil us with really, really high quality paint. And that's not what you're going to ever achieve with the polyfiber system. You can, but there's sort of three things that you're balancing. There's like the base functionality of what you really need to get by, like to seal the fabric, to keep away UV rays. Those two things are sort of a function level, right? Then there's a aesthetic level, which is how pretty it looks, and that's obviously relative, but it's how pretty you think it is, and other people think it is. And then there's a weight function. And you know, you can get ultra low weight, but sacrifice your functionality. You can get ultra low weight, and you're also going to sacrifice some of your aesthetic. You can get ultra high aesthetic, you're not going to sacrifice functionality, but you are going to sacrifice weight. So I could, at the end of the day, come through and chase out some of these blemishes, but at this point, the only thing I'm going to be doing is, one, being vain, and two, just adding weight to the plane. Because every time I chase out wrinkles and stuff like that, I have to put paint back, and I'm always putting back more paint than I'm taking off. And sure, one or two times might not affect it that much, but I've already spent a lot of time sanding, and I've put an extra cross coat on this already to fill in some of the sanding that I did in the past. So let's just, you know, I can show you some of the little bumpies and divots that I'm worried about. Like, for example, that right there. Let's see if we can focus in on that. There's a little bump. It's pretty small, but you can see this whole section is all ridged out. And this whole leading edge, there's another one. There's another one. Let's see, there's another one. There's another one. You can also see this leading edge seam here all the way down the end. So one of the things I talked about in, I guess, maybe one of my last videos was the ordeal that I had covering this leading edge. Because there is a hard surface under here, there should be 2 layers of fabric over it. But the manual just totally butchers this instruction. And you can see the instructions talk about the little fiberglass cups that you normally put, or it's not fiberglass, but PVC covers that you normally put over when you cover this thing. So they say, oh, wrap it over that PVC cover and all the way around the spar. Well, the Laker leading edge doesn't have covering instructions. They just don't address it. What I should have done was, you know, covered all the way to the back of the Laker leading edge. And Polyfiber, and I guess indirectly the Kitfox factory, have confirmed that that is actually how you're supposed to do it. The manual does not instruct that. So not only myself, but also Brian Bowen was misled, and I'm sure other people have been misled in the past. And this ends up being a less superior covering. I ended up covering with a single piece of fabric here. It meant that I had to do some shrinking with poly brushed on fabric, and it ended up having a ton of wrinkles and bubbles that I just, you know, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time chasing them out because it's time versus aesthetic, which I think that I'll take the aesthetic loss for the extra time that I get back, and frustration. Yeah, I'd say pretty much 80% of the wrinkle blemishes on this plane are a result of me improperly covering this leading edge, which I wouldn't have done had I had better instructions, but you live and you learn, and life goes on. Okay, I guess I'll say that what this is the final color coat, polytone coat that is on the plane, and it's identical to the poly spray color. Actually, I shouldn't say they're identical, they're almost identical. The poly spray, which is legal, by the way, it's perfectly legal to just fly around with just poly spray on. It's just a little bit matted, more matted out than the polytone. Polytone's a little bit glossier. Kind of like the matted look a little better, but I'm not going back. The poly spray actually is easier to get runs when you spray it on. Sorry, not poly spray, the polytone. I noticed that it runs a little bit more easier because it's a little thinner. It's a nice tacky. I'm putting one more small color coat on this, but as I said, waiting for that paint to show up, and who knows when it's going to get here. But I'm just keeping the progress moving on in the meantime. So I guess I'm going to talk about my general painting process. Like, what actually do I do to paint this thing? And I'd like to say that painting has not been my favorite activity. The MEK is not fun to breathe. You're always fighting temperatures. I'm not good at painting. It's hard. So I found like I was struggling a lot, and I did get better with time, but at the end of the day, I kept making small mistakes that cost me a lot of time. And if I had been more experience, I wouldn't have made them. But you don't get there without doing it. And AirTech Coatings, which is another covering system very similar to polyfiber, they have a lot of good videos. And actually, I learned a lot about painting and just covering from their system, which is very similar to polyfiber. So sure, some of the stuff doesn't apply exactly, but general chemistry and like the general fabric covering process is very well addressed in their videos. Way better than polyfiber's videos on what they're talking about. So the way that I painted these is, first things first, you get the poly brush down, the pink coats, you spray 2 of those on. And I did talk to the guys at Consolidated Aircraft Coatings. They said you can put more of that on if you want. The instructions are pretty pretty vague in the manual. And I ended up putting 4 coats on the tail surfaces because I thought it was 2 cross coats. It turns out it's just 2 straight coats. You don't need cross coats. But I said, oh, is that going to be a problem? They said, no, it's just adhesive. It's going to look a little bit glossier, and it'll be heavier. So I added weight to the tail surfaces. But at the end of the day, it's not going to cause any structural problems. So poly brush goes on, but it's sprayed. You let that dry. Then what I do is I put a half cross coat of poly spray, the silver stuff, and that's what I'll call my identifier coat. So that allows me to see blemishes and wrinkles that I wouldn't have normally seen with just the poly brush on, because that pink stuff, very, very hard to see blemishes. And the way that I actually get blemishes out once that poly spray silver is on, which allows me to find those ridges and bumps, is I take a piece of Teflon sheet that I bought on Amazon. I actually have 2 of them, 2 little squares. I put it over the bump that I want. I keep it perfectly still, and I rub the iron over the sheet just to get that sort of blemish out. And then I leave it there. And I go with another sheet and go to the next one and work on the next one. And by the time I'm done with the next one, this one will have cooled off, and you can just peel it off, and it'll have flattened out the area. And my Teflon has a sort of a weave to it. It's a threaded Teflon. So it leaves this small cross-hatching on the fabric, but it ends up pushing a lot of the bumps down. So I did a once through after that half cross coat and got all the blemishes that I thought were obvious and big. And then everything you can get with the iron, it makes sense to get with the iron, because the only thing you can do after, I guess, the second coat, sure, you can come back with the iron, but is really sand. So once I got that first half cross coat done with the iron, I went back, did a full cross coat of poly spray, let it dry, pulled it out into the sunlight so I could see really well, and sanded out any of the runs, blemishes, or anything I thought looked bad. Then you clean it with 2210 paint surface cleaner, wait 2 hours, put it in the booth, spray it, again with a full cross coat, let it wait and dry. I realized that you can sand it usually within about 2 hours if it's warm enough. So I ended up sanding about 2 hours after I sprayed. That was pretty nice because you could keep progress moving along. So started sanding again, got only the very minimum, I did the very minimum amount of sanding after the second coat, just things that were really big and obvious I got out. If any runs or big bumps, I worked on those a little bit, And then I did generally sort of take out some of these like silver globs that were all over the wing. Then clean it again with 2210 paint surface cleaner, let it dry for 2 hours, put it back in the booth, and my final poly spray coat I would put on and then pull it out, and it didn't touch it. I did pull it out in the sun. If there's any runs, which I think there was 1 or 2 after that for at least one of the wings, I did some tiny little bit of sanding, but you're not supposed to spray that last coat. So you're supposed to put back all the poly spray that you took off. So if you do a lot of sanding, you have to go and hit those spots where you sanded a lot. I was really worried about that, so I ended up putting on probably a little more paint than I needed to. Turns out that this silver coat that I put on, it's called the Nevada Silver. This Nevada Silver, Rancho Silver, and Piper Trainer Blue all have the same UV properties as the poly spray. It's not as intense as the poly spray, but they still have that aluminum stuff in it that keeps UV spray out. So I felt good not going through and chasing all those sand spots because I was going to put 2 additional coats of UV protecting paint on top of it. So that's just a little tidbit that they talk about in the polyfiber manual in the ultralight section. But it's good to know that anything that's metallic or Piper Trainer Blue has that UV protecting properties. So that was my general process. I am going to use, as I said, I'm waiting on this last paint, but I am going to do one more paint run for my design, which will be super cool. Can't wait to get that done. But there's one more paint coating on top of this, but that's going to be pretty quick. It's going to be mostly a masking job. I've got the special curved masking paper or masking tape, and it'll take a lot of time to mask, but very quick time to paint because it'll just be a few dustings, and we'll rip the masking tape off, and it'll be good to go. All right. Well, if I didn't make mistakes, or if I said I didn't make mistakes, I'd be lying to you. Here's an example of one. I've done this 3 times, and I figured out why I kept doing it. What I was doing is I was sanding with 400 grit. And the manual very specifically states not to hit any hard surfaces underneath. They say stay away from ribs, rivets, rib laces, any hard surfaces beneath the fabric. That's a very obvious hard surface. It's the back of this basically false rib underneath the wing. So I was sanding, and the sandpaper sort of got soft. So I threw away that piece of sandpaper, got a fresh piece of 400 grit, and within the first stroke of that fresh 400 grit, I sanded a hole all the way through the fabric down to the wood. And I thought maybe I can leave it there, and I just decided I was going to put a patch over the paint because you're allowed to do that. They said it looks pretty ugly, and yes, it does. It looks ugly, can confirm, but am I going to recover the entire wing? No. And the reason why I put a patch on top on this one is because I did the same thing on the horizontal stabilizer, which I will show you is even worse than this. So horizontal stabilizer, did the same thing, was sanding with light sandpaper that was really worn out. I threw that away, got new sandpaper, and within 2 strokes, I burned 2 holes all the way through the fabric down on top of this rib twice, for this one and for this one. So this time I thought, oh gee, I'm going to do this right. I'm going to patch it by taking MEK. You can pull up all the material, and you can see where I pulled MEK material off to. And then you put a patch down, which I did, and then repainted my poly brush, and then repainted on top of it. And it turns out that it's just horrible. I mean, just disgustingly horrible. But I'm not going to recover this. I am going to put some paint over this section right here so it hides it to an extent. But that is an example of a mistake that I made by being a doofus. Okay, all in all, painting's not that hard, technically speaking. It does take a lot of practice. There's some muscle memory involved and just some basic understanding of the equipment that just takes literally just man hours. You put the time in, you get familiar with the gun, and it just gets easier the more you basically use your equipment. It does require a lot of patience. I don't find it very enjoyable. It was basically paint, wait, sand, wait, paint, wait, sand, wait, paint, wait, sand, wait, over and over and over again until you finally said, well, it's not going to look perfect, so I got to stop painting at some point in time. And you just sort of I accepted that I'm not going to make this perfect, and decided to move on with the build from there. So we're not done painting. We got a little bit more to throw on here, but I just thought I'd reflect on the process as a whole. The HVLP sprayer that I'm using, it's the Apollo sprayer, super awesome system. AirTech Coatings, as I mentioned earlier, has a lot of great content about this, and they talk about the HVLP system and how it's a much lower pressure. Again, it's high volume, low pressure, It's much lower pressure than a traditional paint gun, and that actually has a drawback because you're more likely to get orange peel, and it's harder to get basically the paint to fully atomize and lay smooth down on the surface of the fabric. So I was painting at medium air volume or air pressure, whatever it is. I ended up turning that all the way up, so I had full power on the turbine. That helped me out a lot. I was actually using a lot less material because I didn't have to sort of gob over to get a fill. It was hitting the fabric hard and flattening out. A lot less orange peel. Just in general, the higher pressure worked for me a lot better. So when I started using that higher power setting on the HVLP sprayer, I found myself using a lot less material, and that's good because the paint is one of the heavier components of the covering process. I think it is probably the heaviest component of the covering process. I heard from the AirTech guys that every coat, or maybe it's cross coat, is about 7 pounds. So if you really wanted to look pretty, as I said, you end up losing a lot of weight, or actually gaining a lot of weight in paint. And that was one thing I also decided is I don't want to add too much weight to this plane. I haven't been a total weight weenie on this, so this is probably going to weigh more than a lot of people's builds. You know, I probably did a little bit too much weight on the tail in paint, and then maybe too much polybrush in some places. And you know, there's across the board, I wasn't as conscientious of weight as somebody, you know, other people might have been. But again, my first plane, so if it flies, I'll be happy. It will fly. I'm just not trying to make the ultimate awesome plane. This is just sort of a stock average build, just to get something in the air that will be enjoyable for a long time. So yeah, in general, I think the painting process kind of sucks. And you know, there's fumes that are hard on your brain. You always have to wait for temperature. I messed up a lot. They made a lot of mistakes that are obvious and aesthetically very noticeable on the plane. But you know, it's not that bad. It's not that hard. It does take a long time, but I'm glad to be done with it. Would I want to do it again? Probably not. I mean, I would think about an aluminum plane or the Oratech system because painting process for me was just not that fun. But you know, it's really not that hard. So yeah. One thing that kind of brings me to is a discussion about MEK, which is methyl ethyl ketone. The polyfiber system is all MEK based. So the solvent that keeps everything in solution is MEK. And Brian Bowen was looking out for my health and commented about how I should be wearing gloves when I'm working with MEK. And I thought to myself, well, crap, I've been doing most of the covering process without gloves. That means I've been touching MEK, you know, dipping my finger in MEK, using my finger to run out glue marks. You know, I got polybrush on my hands, some of it on my legs and skin and stuff like that. And I thought, you know, surely I'm going to die of cancer. But I ended up doing some research, and I think my health is going to be okay. I wasn't sure why MEK had this stigma. I mean, California's banned it since 2011 or 2016, something like that. It's hard to get. The big box hardware stores won't carry it, and I think that's because California banned it because it's such a big market. A lot of people have basically sort of turned their back on MEK as a viable solvent. It's a very important solvent. It's very important for high solids vinyl-based coatings. It's very effective at what it does. But the reason why California banned it, and this is something I looked up, not because it has health effects. There are no conclusive studies that say that it causes cancer or any negative health effects in, you know, the average exposures. It doesn't mean it doesn't cause problems. It's just there was nothing conclusively done that said MEK will give you X disease or will give you cancer. They do say it's not likely carcinogenic. It is a naturally occurring compound. Now, the MEK I have in the jar over there, you know, they didn't go milk cats to get. They definitely distilled that in a cracker plant in Kansas City, and it's definitely from crude oil feedstock. But it is basically a naturally occurring compound called butanone, which makes it sound a little less intense. So the reason why California banned it is because it releases a lot of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and that's the nature of really any solvent. One of the things that makes a paint solvent good is that it holds things in solution, but it also dries off and allows you to basically leave behind what was in solution in some form of crystal lattice or whatever flowed together function like a vinyl coating like this. So the MEK, by nature of it being a solvent, also means it releases volatile organic compounds. And these are just organic compounds, which are carbon chains or hydrocarbon chains that are gaseous, usually at room temperature, so they evaporate in the air, and then you have small carbon chains floating around the air that you can breathe. And California doesn't like VOCs. They think it's bad for household air qualities. They banned basically all like aerosol products, acetone, denatured alcohol. I mean, basically anything that's a solvent, you can't use in California. I mean, you can use it, but they're pressuring vendors to pull them off the shelves. So are VOCs going to kill you? I mean, people have been using them for a long time, and they probably have some bad health effects, but I think that I'm personally going to be okay. Should I be wearing gloves with MEK in the future? Absolutely. I will plan on doing that. The last time I wore gloves, it dissolved them, so I had got the wrong type of gloves, so that's why I wasn't wearing them. But just for my own research and maybe for other people's information, MEK is probably less bad for you than acetone, and probably less bad for you, definitely less bad for you than denatured alcohol. That stuff has poison in it. So I just feel a little better knowing that, and I appreciate people thinking about my health. It does make you loopy, like even with an organic respirator, painting for a full day, I don't have a fresh air respirator, but painting for a full day is hard. It's hard on your brain. It makes me irritable and tired and hungry. Really makes me super hungry and thirsty. So I just don't like being around the solvents. So if I don't have to be around them, I won't, but probably not going to kill you. So just a little tidbit that I thought I'd throw in there that I did some research about, and something people should all look into, because just because California bans it doesn't mean that it's bad. And I've lived in California. They ban everything. And I don't live in California for a reason. Okay, that just about wraps it up for painting. As I said, I've got one more little coat that I'm going to throw on here, which, again, whenever the paint shows up, we'll get to that. I'm just going to mask this thing off and throw paint on it just as it is. I don't think I'm going to paint the bottom, because, I'm not going to see it unless I'm not directly over people, which I don't really care about. From here on, I'm going to start working on the engine. So the engine's here. I don't know if everybody knows what type of engine it is, but it's on the shelf there. And tomorrow, actually, I'm going to pull it out of the box and see if I can get a firewall on and a ring mount up, and maybe have an engine on this thing tomorrow. So all pretty exciting. I'm not going to let this Texas weather storm slow me down, because it's really taken about 5 days out of my schedule, and I'm supposed to go up to the field in a few weeks. So that's going to throw a wrench in my plan about getting this done sooner. There's things in my mind of how long I think it's going to take, and then there's a reality. I can't control winter storms that are going to stop my packages from showing up on time. So we just make the best with what I got. But either way, the project's going to move on, and I'm just going to keep hammering this out until we get it done. So stay tuned. We'll get an engine on. We'll get the panel on next week maybe, and hopefully make some good progress before I do a quick stint up in the north. So thanks for watching, and look forward to doing it again soon.